I'm going to speak to you about lessons in leadership from the greatest generation, but I would like to tell you that I hope that some of these stories will be an encouragement to you as you go about doing what you do and making a positive difference in the lives of so many people. Like many of you, I was raised in the company of heroes. Growing up in the 1950s and 60s, I realized there was something special about my childhood. I couldn't put it into words as a boy, but I felt it with all my heart. I knew that I was growing up in the company of heroes. They were all around me, at church, at school, when I went shopping or went to a movie or a restaurant, a department store. They were there at sporting events, at family reunions, at the neighbor's house. They were my father's friends, my doctors, my bosses, my uncles, my dad. They were the veterans of World War II. And to me, they were all heroes. Now, I think you can say that about any group of American veterans in our history, but those World War II veterans have always had a special hold on my heart. No Americans of any era faced greater challenges, shouldered greater responsibilities, or were willing to take greater risks, all for what was right. They were the last generation of Americans raised by parents born in the 19th century, a time when Judeo-Christian values on which America was founded were openly embraced and routinely taught to American children, and the parental training the greatest generation received showed itself. First, in how that generation handled the Great Depression, and especially in the service and sacrifices its members made in World War II. No matter whether they were the few who saw combat or the many who supported frontline troops, the Americans of that generation were heroes to me. And so were the people who loved them and waited for their return. Long before I ever heard the phrase, the greatest generation, I believe they were. Even as a boy, I knew that I was blessed to be living in the company of heroes. And now I'd like to share with you some of what I've learned over the years from them, from that greatest generation, from the American men and women who triumphed over the Great Depression and won the greatest war in history. I'd like to share with you 5 lessons in leadership from the greatest generation. Leadership lesson number 1, real leaders take care of their people. 2,700 American prisoners of war held captive in a Japanese prison camp in World War II learned that lesson in leadership in a way they would never forget, thanks to Navy Commander Richard N. Antrim. He was the 35-year-old executive officer of the destroyer USS Pope, fighting in the South Pacific. And even before he landed in a Japanese prison camp, Dick Antrim was taking care of his people. In early 1942, his ship was sunk by Japanese naval aircraft at the Battle of Java Sea. When the crew abandoned ship, even though he was wounded, he managed to keep the survivors from drifting apart by tying their life rafts together. And he kept up their morale while they drifted at sea for 3 days. It was a valiant effort, saved lives, but Commander Antrim and his sailors were captured by a Japanese warship and imprisoned in a Japanese prison camp on the Celebes Island in Indonesia. Treatment of Allied prisoners of war by Imperial Japan was horrible. American prisoners were routinely starved and often beaten. POWs were bayoneted or shot for little or no reason, and officers who protested or who even asked questions were often beheaded. In April of 1942, an American POW in Dick Antrim's prison camp, a U.S. naval officer, was savagely punished in front of the whole camp. The American POWs watched in helpless frustration while Japanese guards beat their fellow prisoner to the ground, beat him until he was unconscious, and then still kept beating him. The young officer was near death. The assembled POWs were near despair. And Dick Antrim knew if he intervened, he could be beheaded, but he acted anyway. He calmly stepped forward, faced the Japanese guards, and asked if he could take the rest of the victim's punishment. The guards were stunned by such a request. They weren't accustomed to such self-sacrificing leadership. That wasn't the way of a military dictatorship. They looked at each other, they looked at the beaten prisoner, they looked at Dick Antrim in amazement, and then they walked away. The prisoner was saved, the POWs were inspired, and Dick Antrim was later awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor. Commander Richard Antrim made a difference because he understood a key principle of leadership. Real leaders always take care of their people. Leadership lesson number 2. Real leaders take responsibility. At 10 p.m. English time, June the 5th, 1944, American paratroopers of the 101st and 82nd Airborne Divisions were waiting in airfields throughout southern England, waiting to board their C-47 aircraft for D-Day. The Allied invasion of France was finally underway, and in a couple of hours, in the darkness of D-Day, June 6, 1944, they would jump from their C-47s or they would crash land in gliders onto the deserted fields of Normandy. Well, just before they received the order to enter battle, to board those transports and gliders, they got a visit from General Dwight D. Eisenhower. Eisenhower was the supreme Allied commander for Europe, the mastermind of D-Day, and the man who was sending tens of thousands of young Americans in uniform into harm's way. Generals didn't usually chat with privates, but that evening, on the eve of D-Day, General Eisenhower walked among the ranks of the 101st Airborne, talking to the men, asking where they were from, talking about fishing or baseball, asking what they were going to do when they won the war, talking about the America they all loved, the America they were all willing to die for. He was trying to encourage them, but typical of the greatest generation, they encouraged him. "Quit worrying, General," one paratrooper told him. "We'll take care of this thing for you." Soon afterwards, these young paratroopers were in the dark skies over Normandy. Many of them were shot out of the sky when they parachuted, or they landed in rivers or fields flooded by the Germans and weighed down with their equipment, they drowned. Others were killed when their gliders skidded across flooded fields and crashed into hedgerow fences. But most made it. And as ordered, they fought hard, they seized key crossroads and bridges, and held back German reinforcements until the main American force could move in from the beaches. The Allied landings occurred at dawn as planned. Troops poured ashore from 4 of the 5 Allied beaches, from Utah, Gold, Juneau, and Sword, but on one American beach, the D-Day invasion bogged down. That beach was codenamed Omaha, and it would enter history as Bloody Omaha. There, the beachside bluffs were high, the defenses were strong, the German troops were tough, and the first 2 waves of American troops were slaughtered in many places. Hours passed with no breakthrough. It seemed possible the whole invasion might fail. At Omaha Beach, D-Day might fail. It was no fault of General Eisenhower's. His planning and coordination of the largest amphibious invasion in history was brilliant. If it failed, surely the blame would not be his. But if D-Day did fail, Dwight Eisenhower was prepared to take full responsibility for it. Besides his closest aides, nobody knew that even before the invasion began, General Eisenhower had written a public statement to be released to the American people if the Allied landings in Normandy were not successful. In it, he would have explained very humbly that the failure of D-Day was not the fault of his soldiers. The responsibility for it was his, and his alone. Well, it didn't fail, of course. American soldiers on Bloody Omaha finally fought their way through the German defenses. The Allied forces that landed on the beaches of Normandy leaked with the paratroopers and began driving the Germans back to France. D-Day was a tremendous success. And in less than 1 year, Nazi Germany was defeated, and VE Day, Victory in Europe, was being celebrated by Americans everywhere. As for General Eisenhower, he would eventually become President Eisenhower, largely as a result of the leadership example he set as the Supreme Allied Commander. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, the man credited by history as the victor of D-Day, understood a key truth of leadership. Real leaders always take responsibility. Leadership lesson number 3. Real leaders don't give up easily. They persevere. Now, don't feel uninformed if you've never heard the name Elaine Wright. She wasn't famous. She didn't go to war. She wasn't even in the military. But Elaine Wright was a real leader of the greatest generation. During World War II, she was a volunteer at the USO canteen in North Platte, Nebraska. The USO was a private nonprofit group that brought entertainment to the troops, some 400,000 performances in World War II. But its most popular contribution was the USO canteen. Canteens were set up in churches, storefronts, and railway stations, and they gave young Americans in uniform who were far from home little things that meant a lot. A hot cup of coffee, a cold sandwich, a warm smile. North Platte, Nebraska was just a little prairie farming community in the middle of the nation. But lots of troop trains stopped there for water. And Elaine Wright and the other women volunteers wanted to do their part. So they made and passed out sandwiches, donuts, and coffee to soldiers, sailors, and Marines every day from daylight until the last train left. Elaine Wright was a middle-aged mom. Her husband worked for the railroad. They had one grown son. He had gone off to serve his country in the Army. So when she served those young men in uniform at the North Platte canteen, she thought about her son and hoped that somewhere, someone was helping him. And then one day, she didn't show up at the canteen as usual. The other volunteers thought that was odd until they heard the news. Elaine's son had been killed in action. Nobody would have been critical of Elaine Wright if she had never come back to volunteer at the canteen. She had done more than her share. But a few days later, there she was, handing out sandwiches, donuts, and coffee. "I can't help my son," she said, "but I can help someone else's son." The government didn't pay the volunteers at the North Platte USO or even pay for the food and drink they gave away. But by war's end, Elaine Wright and the other volunteers at the little North Platte, Nebraska canteen had served more than 6 million Americans in uniform. And for generations to come, Elaine Wright of the North Platte USO canteen will personify the tremendous contribution of American civilians in World War II, because she understood that real leaders don't give up easily. They persevere. Leadership lesson number 4. Real leaders are self-starters. Corporal James Day proved that in May of 1945. He was a young Marine from East St. Louis who found himself at the bloodiest battle in the Pacific theater of World War II, the Battle of Okinawa. When American forces reached Okinawa, they were on Japanese soil, and the Japanese fought even more fanatical than usual, eventually losing more than 100,000 of their troops at Okinawa. James Day was a squad leader in the 6th Marine Division. And at Okinawa, his squad was sent out ahead of the Marine front lines as forward observers. Almost immediately, Corporal Day and his squad came under a barrage of Japanese mortar and artillery fire, and when it ended, they were attacked by a Japanese banzai charge. Corporal Day directed a powerful return fire which turned back the enemy attack, but half his squad was killed or wounded. Soon it was dark, and the Japanese made repeated attacks. 3 times in quick succession, Japanese troops came screaming out of the darkness in banzai charges. Corporal Day and his squad stopped them all, but more Marines were killed and more were wounded. As the hours passed that night, Corporal Day could hear the wounded Marines calling in the darkness for corpsmen, for medics, but there were no medics. Corporal Day listened to the heart-rending cries of his wounded fellow Marines until he couldn't take it anymore. He decided someone had to do something, and he was that someone. So he crawled through the darkness until he found one of the wounded Marines, hoisted him on his back, and raced back through the darkness to the Marine main line. Japanese heard him and opened fire, but he made it. He could have stayed there in safety, but he didn't. Back he went and found another wounded man and carried him to the rear under heavy fire. And then he did it again, and again, and again. He carried 5 of his fellow Marines to the rear under savage enemy fire and saved their lives. That was more than enough selfless courage for any man at any time. But Corporal Day went back to his forward position and manned a light machine gun just in time for another Japanese banzai charge. There were only a handful of Marines able to fight now, but they turned back the attack thanks mainly to Corporal Day and his machine gun. This time, however, he was wounded and his machine gun was destroyed. He lay there in the darkness, wounded, no machine gun. Why not slip away in the night and seek safety? Who could have blamed him after all he had done? But James Day knew that if the Japanese got by him, other Marines in his rear would have to fight them, so he chose to stay. He scrounged around in the darkness, gathered rifles from fallen Marines, and waited. The Japanese soon attacked again, and Day led the few surviving Marines in such a fierce defense that they finally broke the Japanese line, with the Japanese attackers falling just short of his foxhole. Finally, the attacks ended. Marine reinforcements reached Corporal Day's position, and he was taken to the rear for medical treatment. And then his fellow Marines counted the enemy bodies lying in front of Corporal Day's foxhole, and they numbered more than 100. Corporal Day, it turned out, and the handful of Marines with him, had been battling a major Japanese assault aimed for the main line of Marines in the rear. And near the end, Corporal Day had almost single-handedly stopped it. For that, Corporal James Day, age 19, was awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor. But the larger honor to him was the body count that nobody could really make. Nobody could really calculate how many American lives had been saved by his heroic actions. Without question, Corporal James Day, willing to risk all, had demonstrated leadership lesson number 5, real leaders are self-starters. And finally, the final lesson in leadership from the greatest generation: real leaders always lead by example. The young American lieutenant did not seem like a movie star military hero. He was soft-spoken, a young man from rural Pennsylvania, a devout Christian, 22 years old. He was quiet and humble, not a boaster or a bossy type. But he had the makings of a leader, and his commanding officer saw it right away. He had volunteered for the Army because he wanted to do his duty, get the war over as quickly as possible, and get back home. He had joined the Army Airborne, became a paratrooper, had been chosen for officers' candidate school, had done well there in his quiet, wise, and responsible way. Afterwards, as an officer, whenever he was leading, the men under him always seemed to be motivated to do better. And he was soon promoted from lieutenant to captain. What elements of leadership did this quiet, unassuming young officer display? He took care of his people, and his men loved him for it. He was willing to take responsibility when things went wrong, and his men respected him for it. He persevered under hardship, and so his men did too. He was a self-starter, and so his men willingly followed him. And he led by example. When other officers were off in town on a weekend pass, he was often found leading new recruits on a field march. Why? Because he believed it was his duty to do that if they had to. He knew the most effective leadership, real leadership, came from personal example. He didn't shirk the hard duty, the dirty work, the jobs nobody wanted, and he didn't complain. Why not? Because he wanted to lead by example. And he did. He set an example of genuine character, personal faith, and duty done well. Real leadership, leadership by example. He rose from lieutenant to captain to major. He was the officer that soldiers wanted to serve under, the man they wanted to follow. He led them into Normandy on D-Day, parachuting into enemy territory with the 101st Airborne. When he drew a deadly assignment to knock out a Nazi artillery battery firing on Utah Beach, his soldiers followed him without question, and his leadership example paid off. He and his men made a classic flank assault on that German artillery battery on a farm in Normandy called Brecourt Manor. And they took out one German artillery piece after another until the entire battery was silenced. And they did it with such teamwork and such efficiency and with so few casualties that for more than half a century, cadets at West Point would study what became known as the assault at Brecourt Manor. He was promoted to battalion commander, still leading by example, but now leading much larger numbers of American troops. He led them through Operation Market Garden in Holland, through the Battle of the Bulge in Belgium, through the American drive across Germany until the end of the war in Europe. A man of character, faith, and duty who led by example. Outside of his circle of friends and colleagues, no one really knew his name or his story, except those men who had followed him. But those soldiers never forgot him. Those men of Easy Company of the 101st Airborne, that band of brothers, as they would become known, loved him and respected him because of his personal example of leadership. And a generation later, when a famous historian came to write the story of D-Day and later the story of Easy Company, every surviving old soldier that he interviewed talked with reverent respect about the man who led by example, Major Richard Winters, Dick Winters. The story became a best-selling book, The Band of Brothers. And so the world learned of Dick Winters, who came to represent the best of the greatest generation. A man of character, faith, and duty who understood the ultimate lesson in leadership: real leaders lead by example. Lessons in leadership from the greatest generation. They'll still work today if we faithfully follow them. 1, real leaders take care of their people. 2, real leaders take responsibility. 3, real leaders don't give up easily, they persevere. 4, real leaders are self-starters. And 5, real leaders lead by example. Lessons in leadership from the greatest generation. May we always remember them. Thank you.